About 5 weeks ago, I was in Shanghai. It's another city like your capital here in Mexico with 20 million people. And I was at Expo in the Mexican pavilion. And those of you who know anything about the great Shanghai Expo that's going on this year, which is a fantastic experience, will know they have a very large area dedicated towards the future of the city. And in that I saw a figure which struck me, which is that currently in the world there are nearly 3.5 billion people, half the world, who live in cities. Now that figure interests me, as when I first came here to Lyon in the early 70s, 3.5 billion was about the total world population. Now some things have stayed a wee bit the same since the 1970s. Here in Mexico you still have that huge consumer of footwear just north, and you're still working out how to sell shoes in large volumes there. But other things have changed. In the early 70s, we didn't really have trainers. This huge white footwear market, which is so important today, didn't exist at that time. And South Korea was only just beginning to bring people off the land, out of the agricultural community, into export-oriented industries that were labor-intensive and were led by footwear. So there have been some very significant changes. Now all of us who do work in the leather and the leather footwear business know that we can't just look at one part of the chain. We have to look at everything that happens from farmyard to shopping mall. And one has to take into account not just what we call the supply chain, but the other important organizations that provide the chemicals, the machinery, and the advice and help that's needed. It's not really a chain. It's much more a complex network. And if we understand it as a network, we will make much better decisions. Now in looking at the leather part, and it does count too for the footwear, the main characteristic is that the industry is full of family businesses. Businesses that fit into the category, as we've just heard, of the small and medium-sized enterprises. And you place these companies between the big brands like the Walmarts, the Marks and Spencers, and the brands like Nike and Clarks and Louis Vuitton on the one hand, and the big raw material suppliers like the Tysons and the JBS on the other. You can see that in the middle, the businesses are squeezed by what we call asymmetric relationships, having to deal with much larger and much more powerful organizations, both in front of us and behind us. And being squeezed like this creates low margins. It makes life tough. And if, particularly in leather, you add in the growing capacity from tanneries being built in new parts of the world without equivalent closure in the old, you can see a situation arising with increasing environmental problems as well, where you do actually start to wonder, why do we stay in business at all? Now the trends of the last few decades have been quite strong. Footwear used to be about 70% of the consumption of all the leather made in the world. Through the last decade that dropped to about 50%. And on the other hand, we've seen upholstery leather, which in 1990 was only about 1% of all leather made. That's upholstery for automobiles particularly. And by 2005, that had moved to nearly 10%. And also through the last 15 years, general furniture leather and aviation leather has also grown. And go back 30 years and you'll see that leather was a necessity in a very large number of articles. But new textiles, membranes, new insulation materials, some clever plastics, some clever synthetics mean that there is now an alternate for every leather use in the world. We used to think that since the leather industry's size is scaled upon the raw material supply rather than upon consumer end use, that as demand grew, as the population grows, that leather would become more valuable. But with all this substitution, we now know that that's not true. Most significantly, in the first quarter of 2008, for the first time, we saw definitive figures which indicated that leather was now used in less than 50% of all the shoes made in the world. Figures are difficult to measure because it depends whether you put in things like chapals and thongs, the flip-flop type of footwear, into the equation. But I think everyone in the footwear industry worldwide was satisfied that by 2008 we knew that the majority of footwear worldwide was not dependent upon leather. Now there are some types of shoes which of course do still require leather. But generally speaking, the footwear industry is able to tell us that if leather's price rises too high, it can look to be substituted by other clever materials. And we've seen this trend in sports gloves like golf, where the full leather glove is now a rarity, and a combination of leather and synthetic, or even full synthetic, is much more common on the fairway than just 15 years ago. Now we call all these overall trends, I can hit this correctly, macro-environmental issues. It's a marketing word, and it's just a term used for the examination of the big issues under the headings of political, economic, social, technical, environmental, and legal, and interrogating these to see what the likely impact on our business and suppliers and customers. And for any of you who knew the late Don Roberto Palomo from Empresas Ad Hoc in El Salvador, who's certainly my most important mentor through my career, any meeting that you had with him after a year or two away was always a discussion on precisely these terms. You would be sitting down and exploring what the implications for all these global changes were. Now, I just mentioned before that when I first came here, there was only 3.5 billion people in the world. And for quite a few of us in the room who are a little older, when we were born, there were only 2.5 billion people. And now we're nearly 7. Now, all during the 20th century, the growth in population, so we moved from 2 to 2.5 to 3.5 to 4 and to more, meant a growth in the demand for meat and dairy products. And we saw remarkable stability through that period. The cattle herds grew exactly in line with population growth. The leather supply, which is 65% dependent on cattle hides, grew equally. The ratio of square feet of leather per capita worldwide available at the end of the 20th century was almost identical to that was available at the start of the 20th century. But now we're beginning to move past 7 billion people and rushing towards